Good afternoon. I'm David Cragle. Welcome to the first session of RREAF Academy of 2024. This is our fourth year of doing RREAF Academy for our interns, so welcome. I've been with RREAF since August of 2016 as its general counsel and oversee the legal department's work on everything we do. I'm a 35-year M&A lawyer. I have a master's in accounting. My JD was in tax and commercial. I was in finance before I went back to graduate school at 27 and law school. So what I wanted you guys to give you guys was just a quick overview today of how deals work and what you can expect to see in just about every deal you'll ever face categorically, right? On a categorical sort of basis. What is it that we're really talking about when we're talking about a deal? That word's a pretty broad one, right? When you talk about a deal, you may be talking about a contract for a franchise for a restaurant. And that'd be a deal, right? You're going to go make a deal with the franchisor. Well, that's a real limited deal because that's a single contract with a counterparty and the negotiation's limited to that one thing. You'll do some due diligence on the franchise, right? You say, is McDonald's hamburger really a right thing to go here? Or would it be better if I went and talked to Burger King or, somebody else? You need to figure out what the real opportunity is, and you need to dive down into that. Once you've sort of decided that, Burger King's the right one, you go to Burger King franchising and you say to them, hey, I'd like to talk to you about a Burger King franchise at a location approximately here. I'm kind of in the area and studied it, and there's nothing around, you don't have any competing stores around the area. I'd like to talk to you about that. And you'll engage in a conversation. That'd be deal making. The hard stuff is figuring out not only whether the business you're looking at or the asset you're looking at acquiring makes sense from a strategic perspective and a business development perspective and all those sorts of things, but you have to go back and figure out what you don't know. I often say to young people, listen, it's not what you know that hurts you. It's what you don't know that will kill you. Buying is hard because the diligence process requires absolute commitment to detail and asking questions beyond your own, I'm going to use an old Gaelic word, ken. You understand that? Beyond your ken. That is outside of your universe of knowledge that you're not even going to know what questions to ask. So what does that lead us to? You have to have the right group of advisors to make sure you're hearing about issues that you're not even aware of or conversant with, right? And in the real estate business, particularly important that you have local experts, because real estate is not unlike buying stock of a publicly traded company where, the information may be well-known or published or those sorts of things. An individual tract of real estate, that building tract right there, is specific to that particular tract. There is not another tract in the world like it. Not another. It's unique. Every bit of real estate, every tract of real estate, every opportunity in real estate is unique. So we've got these fundamental elements are first, and then we get the prelude, which is our early diligence before we ever contact the seller, right? We've got our early work to see, we want to be in the market. Yeah, that property looks like it might be a good one. Let's go talk to them, that kind of thing. You've got the negotiation between the parties, then execution. When I say execution, I'm not talking about execution of documents. I'm talking about execution of the deal itself, actually making it work, getting to the closing, and then integration is post-closing change in control of the asset and moving into operation of the asset and then operations. But let's talk about a simple RREAF deal. By the way, very few of them are simple, but let's talk about a simple one. We're just going to buy a multifamily apartment project in Tucumcari, New Mexico. Okay? We're going to go through a diligence process. Then we're going to go negotiate with the owner to try to negotiate a contract to buy it, right? Let's assume we're successful and we get that signed up. We're going to end up in a 60 to 90-day due diligence period where we're looking for all the skeletons we were talking about earlier, right? And during that 60 to 90 days, we have a couple of other things we better be doing at the same time. What's happening in every deal all at the same time are three tracks. One is the acquisition track itself, right? We got to get the acquisition. We got to run that track all the way from the beginning, the prelude, all the way to the closing, all right? We've got to run that. That's the acquisition track. At the same time, we need to be raising money in two places. We need to be raising equity, and we need to be raising debt. And those are two completely separate tracks, and they're going to run at the same exact time. I call them capital stack, purchaser debt financing and purchaser equity offering or raise. So we've got to do an equity raise, and it may involve preferred equity or priority equity, as we call it sometimes, which would be institutional capital. Somebody comes in and writes a big check for the equity. But lots of times we're doing a retail investor offering at the same time. From a lawyer's perspective, we're not just ginning out sort of standardized documents. We don't do that. We actually, as business lawyers, get in the business deal. We try to understand the business deal and the finance and everything else to make sure that while we're studying our way through that and understanding it, issues that get raised by interrelation of parties, a post-closing contract, those sorts of things, that we've figured out where the risks are so we can properly describe them in an offering memorandum for the equity capital track, but we can also disclose it to the lender in the loan track, because the lender will also want to know, and we can make sure we're doing our best to try to cover the risk in the acquisition track. And if you don't walk out of here with anything else today, I would recommend that's the thing that I wanted to really tell you, is to remember that in every deal, those three tracks are running, and you need to pay attention to all of them. And they don't always line up nicely in terms of timing, by the way. As you can imagine, sometimes we have problems with equity financing. Sometimes we have problems with the acquisition. We'll run into diligence 30 days out thinking, okay, we've got the equity raised. Yeah, the debt's lined up. And we run into a problem 30 days out with a permit or something else that is going to take another 60 days to get that resolved because of local ordinance or law or some, local governmental agency that's got to issue something, and they're backed up and they don't have time. And so you have to ask for an extension, all right, with the seller, an extension to get that handled. And there may be a negotiation over that issue, right? But those are the kinds of things that are happening in every deal, and you have to be paying attention to all three tracks, and any one of them can jump up and hit you. The prelude, where we're trying to figure out what assets are okay for us to buy or make sense for us to buy, given market setting, timing, all of the other things inside of our house here, right? So you're involved in that as a buyer. The seller typically engages third parties, including a broker, as I said. They produce marketing materials, they market to the world, and they usually provide, these days it's in a Dropbox generally. And in most deals, by the way, not just in real estate, the seller is going to create a Dropbox of materials to which people can be invited to look at those materials and decide, yeah, this makes sense, or no, it really doesn't, or man, I have so many questions, right? And that's prelude. We haven't even entered a contract yet. We just need to figure out whether it makes sense for us to really put the resources that are in it as necessary to move to a contract and then toward a closing. Then we've got a negotiation between the parties, and that negotiation is fairly obvious. We're going to talk about purchase price, but we're also going to talk about terms. We're going to talk about closing deadlines. We're going to talk about assumption of liabilities. There may be certain liabilities that are even contingent liabilities that may attach to a property or a given deal that the seller wants out of, and that as part of the consideration, the buyer may agree to assume that responsibility, right? You can do that. An example of that, a good example of that, would be a franchised hotel. Franchisee, hotel owner-operator, already has a franchise agreement with whatever hotel franchise it is. I'm not going to throw names around. But that contract is between that owner and the franchisor, the hotel franchisor, right? It's not, but most of those can't be purchased without the franchisor's agreement. So now I've got a different negotiation that has to go on. I'm not just negotiating with the seller. I'm now going to go negotiate with the franchisor and make sure they're okay with me stepping in, us stepping in, right? to become the new substituted franchisor, or franchisee rather, franchisee. And in a lot of cases, franchisors can make decisions here. They can decide they want to terminate the previous franchise agreement and enter a new one with their new form, and lots of times they do, because their new form is usually more difficult and more detailed and more specific and has more limitations in it than their previous draft did that they entered into when they put this hotel together 5 or 10 years before. So there are times when, as an acquirer, your only negotiation is not the negotiation with the seller. There are other sub-negotiations that need to occur because of existing contract rights, which, by the way, may be critical to you as a buyer. That contract right may be critical. It may not be assignable. The contract may say, sorry, this can't be assigned, or it can only be assigned with the counterparty's consent, in which case you're now into a new negotiation and another sub-negotiation in the deal to make the deal work, okay? If you want to buy the asset and continue to work it or operate it the way the existing owner operates it. Once we've gone through all of that, we end up in at least at the acquirer level, and with the seller, we enter into a purchase and sale agreement. Let me give you an example. There are some times when rights are embedded in a particular entity, like an operating entity, like a franchised hotel. And that franchised hotel has all kinds of licenses, permits, liquor licenses, food licenses, all kinds of things inside the operator entity. And by the way, there's a lot of different structures that can be used around those, so don't let me mislead you. But let's assume they're inside that operating entity. It just might be that because it's such a pain to have to go get assignments of these major contracts or rights or licenses or permits done, it may be that your negotiation with the seller is, okay, I don't want to buy the asset. I don't want to buy the dirt. I don't want to buy the improvements in the hotel. I don't want to buy the contract separately. I don't want to have to go through that. I'll just buy the equity in the entity, okay? I'll buy 100% of the equity of that entity that currently owns and operates that. So now all I have is a change of equity owner. I don't have any changes in contracts down inside the legal entity. You follow? Now, if contracts are well written that are down inside the legal entity, or laws are written, and they are, there may be limitations on what you can do anyway. In other words, if there's what's called a change of control clause in the underlying documents, the franchise agreement or other agreements, material agreements, if there's a change in control that is more than 51% or more than 50% of the equity interest in the entity changes hands to a third party, then kind of all bets are off. You can't do that. You got to come back to us and get our permission, blah, 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 right? There's lots of that in contracts. Point is, there are several ways to skin the cat when you're acquiring. I can tell you, for example, I'll give you an example that categorically, private equity, when private equity comes in to buy a company or buy a whole series of companies, they're buying equity. They are not buying the assets of the businesses generally in asset transactions. Generally, they're doing equity transactions. Kind of bottom line, more than one negotiation can be happening. Execution. We've got an executed purchase and sale agreement. We've gone down the road. We've gone through all of our diligence for 60 days. We're getting ready to close. We're on the track with our equity and our debt. Everything's headed toward a closing. So during this pre-closing phase, we usually have a 60 to 120 day confirmatory due diligence period. We end up, as a result of diligence, remember that as you're doing your diligence, you're digging through all this stuff, you come across items that are material, you're going back to the seller and saying, hey, wait a minute, we're not interested in closing knowing what we now know that we've discovered in diligence under the terms we currently have in the purchase and sale agreement. That's not acceptable to us. So we'll go ahead and terminate, or we can talk about what an appropriate adjustment would be to the contract to let us get there. So you might have another negotiation as a result of diligence as you're going along, right? The negotiation, by the way, never ends. We're dealing with corporate structure, not just diligence items and fixing diligence items, but we're dealing with corporate structure, making sure that on our side, we're ready to go. We know what's going on. We know how we're laying it out. We've approved it with the lenders and with our capital providers, right? The structures, all those sorts of things. So corporate is working behind the scenes to make sure all that works. But while we're setting this up, and acquisition entities are formed and documented. Lender and equity provider comments to organizational documents are often imposed. Lenders and preferred equity providers always read our LLC operating agreements, all of our operative documents, and not only read them, but they make comments to them and tell us, no, we don't like that. You have to change this provision. No, do this with it. I mean, we get full markups of 60-page LLC agreements from counsel for preferred equity and lenders over specific terms or conditions in our documents that should govern our deal, but they're concerned about how it will impact them, and so they make comments to our organizational documents. Third-party issues in contracts. So as I've suggested to you already, you've got a franchisor, and the franchise says can't assign the franchise, and we need to address that issue. That's an example of this point. And then definitive closing documents. So, a deed to the real estate, assignments of and bills of sale for all the personalty and inventory and everything else that's supposed to be purchased. If we're doing an asset deal, all those documents have to be drafted in advance of closing and approved by all the relevant parties before we're ready to actually sit down at a closing table and sign, put wet ink on everything. Okay? So that's what's happening as we do the execution, as we're executing this acquisition track that's running along here. But your lender and equity tracks are also running. Your loan and equity tracks are running at the same time. They're running at the same time, and you're involved in the same processes with the lender, negotiating over loan documents and provisions in the loan documents, those sorts of things. Many of you may think that loan documents are not negotiable. Remember, don't walk out of here today without thinking everything's negotiable. And when we've progressed all the way to closing, all the equities in place and everything else, obviously the money trades hands, documents get executed, and then, and I often say this to people, especially in operating businesses, it's one thing to buy a piece of raw land. A piece of raw land may have some rights associated with it and other things that we need to be aware of, but there isn't an operation going on. There aren't any employees. There aren't any contracts. There isn't anything being delivered or that needs to be maintained or anything else. So when we talk about operating businesses like a multifamily project that's already existing, we're not building it ground up. It's already in existence when we're buying it, as it is, or a hospitality asset, a hotel asset, the way it is. Then I've often said to people, my experience as an M&A lawyer, both from the outside and the inside, has been that the transition from the prior owner to the new owner post-closing is the most difficult part of an acquisition. So your staff at a particular multifamily project that's been there for 10 years, 5 years or 10 years, you go in and acquire that business. You may want to hire some of those people because they know so much about it, but you may find out that the way they think and the way they do business doesn't line up with the way your organization manages multifamily, as we do down at RREAF Residential at RR Living. There may be entire data systems changeovers that are going to be necessary as part of your diligence process. You identify that up front long before you close and say, okay, we're going to have a specialist who's good at APIs to translate this data from this kind of program over to our program so we can do data dumps so that we don't have to end up, changing the whole system immediately. And then you may have a transition plan to work through and change out that data, especially accounting data. Appreciate if you're accounting at all. Accounting data is based on, in every situation, is based on what's the starting point for all accounting systems? The chart of accounts, right? I guarantee you, I promise you, the chart of accounts in an acquisition target, for the way they see their business and the way they book, is not going to be what your chart of accounts is. Your chart of accounts is going to be different. And so the question is, how do you translate those? How do you translate those prior financials over into yours so you can do comparative work, those kinds of things? It's all transitional work. And it may not sound like it's a big deal, but that transition is a massive amount of work. The the legal beagles, the lawyers and paralegals, once a closing is done, there's some post-closing work that needs to be finished, cleaned up. Files need to be scanned, and document books need to be put together. Clients need to make sure they get all the documents and they get them right, and that sort of thing. But once that's sort of done, that post-closing halo we're through that. The client now has all the work to do. The lawyers don't have any of the work to do. It's already finished. So integration post-closing, you're going to do all these things, take over target management and administration, integrate and replace hardware and software systems, integrate accounting systems, as I've already discussed, integrate operational banking arrangements. All the banking arrangements very likely are going to change. Lender's going to change. Therefore, all the money in the project is now going to have to run through a new lender. I mean, the new lender is going to require that the bank accounts be set up there and that cash be run through there instead of through the old. And so if you've got lockbox, what are called lockbox arrangements under financings, that the customers or tenants may be required to send their money into a lockbox, but that lockbox is now controlled by another bank. And the day we close, we need all that to come over here, which means the people who have arrangements to pay into a certain space, into a certain place, now have to be told, don't pay there. But invariably, no matter whether you tell them or not, a bunch of them are going to pay there. And so you have to have post-closing provisions that allow for that lockbox that wrongly or incorrectly collected the money, that it ends up over in your lockbox, right? So you end up with intercreditor arrangements to handle those sorts of things. So there's lots of that goes on in these kinds of things. Then you're going to have to implement your own new policies and procedures. Obviously, your staff of folks have operated under an old set of policies and procedures. You're now going to have to implement yours and train them into it, and then police it for a while and make sure they're actually doing it, right? Make necessary changes to employment and staffing. I mean, they're doing that down there in RR Living all the time. And then compliance reporting to applicable governmental agencies. There may be regulatory concerns that require us in an acquisition to report the change in control to a licensing agency, for example. And then you're off into operations. And now you're off into what I've already suggested is the hard part. The hard part is transition and actual operations to get this asset that you've acquired into what I've referred to here as steady state under the new operating regime. Okay? And clearly, I say clearly, from a RREAF perspective, we generally don't acquire assets unless we believe there's a real opportunity to upgrade, improve operations, make it more efficient, cash efficient, and operationally efficient, to gain operating net cash flow increases and the like, right? That drives value. So we want to make sure that this new, quote, I'm going to use the word steady state, is a growing steady state, right, as we go. But that's an operational matter that happens through, you guys in asset management, that sort of thing as you go along. Figure out what things need to really happen, and then you adjust as you go. Your plan when you close and what you expect to be doing when you close obviously changes as you learn more about the asset and the business and its operation during that first 90 days or the first year. It may have to take you, that's an important point. It may take you a full year to get through an entire cycle with an operation, for example, a hotel or a multifamily asset in a college town, right? That's a very different situation from a regular multifamily asset somewhere in, the working area of Dallas. Very different, because the market influences on the students coming in and out, and when they come in and out, when they sign up leases. What's the window? It's a narrow window. You don't have, unlike a normal multifamily complex, you have new tenants signing up every month, right? And old tenants getting out. It's constant sort of turnover. Well, if 60% of the tenants in a multifamily are students, might not even be considered student housing, right? But 60% of them are tenants, you better know that. And you better know that to get those folks signed up, you're probably going to need to market and get all that finished before the 1st of June, right? Or thereabouts, or maybe during the summer of the year before, right? It's when new folks are, new kids are going to be coming in. So again, operations specific to every deal and critical that the transition in operations be targeted and that it get that particular asset working in the way your firm, your group, in this case, RREAF, intends for it to go. I threw one more thing out here in the deal this year that I decided to do, and that was to just make mention of one of our most recent multifamily portfolio acquisition was what we referred to at one point was the HPX portfolio, but it's we refer to it as the Southeast multifamily portfolio, and it was a portfolio of 10 multifamily complexes in seven different states, each affected by differing state laws and ordinances, as I've already suggested. Right, you get into a new state, every piece of real estate is different. You've got to invest in time and effort in every single piece of real estate as though it's the only asset you're buying, even if you do a portfolio of 10 of them, which means 10 times the work, right? That, as I said, buying is the hard part. You actually have to dig down and do the work. We financed these properties with Freddie Mac loans on each of the 10 properties, and normally when we do Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae financing, ordinarily it's each asset has its own loan. It's a separate loan, even if it's a portfolio of 21, like we did with Transcoastal 21. There were 21 different loans. Every one of them, as I recall, that was a Fannie Mae deal. But there were 21 separate loans and 21 separate sets of loan documents, one each dedicated to the specific property. Right? In some cases, the agencies have begun to do what we call cross-default loans, and we did that in the HPX, in the SE3 transaction, where the lender decided that the 10 properties needed to be divided up into 5 sets of 2s, and they decided which 2 properties needed to be together, hooked together, cross-defaulted together, and presumably, I don't know about the analysis, but I think if we talk to somebody in underwriting, I think this is what we'd find, that ultimately what they did was they did a bit of the seeding. Imagine seeding 10 teams in a bracket. We're going through baseball brackets and softball brackets. What we're talking about is cross-defaulting across loans. And so think of it as seeding, where you seed 1 against 10 and 2 against 9 and 3 against 8 as you go together. Because what you're doing is pooling risk. You're taking the least risky asset, the best performing asset, and putting it together and cross-defaulting it with the worst performing asset. So in some respects, and I'm not an underwriter, but in some respects, that's the sort of match-up that would be going on in a cross-defaulting situation like that, where the lender would be looking for ways to assure that if a poorly performing asset went south, that an equally good performing asset on the other side of the margin would help to make up the difference if a foreclosure was necessary, right? If a foreclosure and sale was necessary. We haven't had any of that, but that's what the lenders are planning for when they plan for those documents in that way. We did a substantial retail equity offering from our investors, and then we brought in a very large institutional equity provider who provided preferred equity in that situation. Preferred equity to book a huge tranche of the equity to make that possible, to make that deal possible, to capitalize it. It's sort of off to my closing thoughts here, and that is deals involve processes, not just assets. It's important. Deals involve processes that are necessary to successful execution, but those processes vary from industry to industry, and even within our industry, from category of asset to category of asset. So, for example, I've given you a closing checklist for a land acquisition and land development. That is an entirely different checklist from the checklist that you'll see across the table. That's the TC21 loan closing checklist. This is the lenders, this is the law firms that was involved in TC21. This is their loan closing checklist. And if you flipped through this, you'd see all the things that the lender is looking at and trying to make sure they've covered. Okay? And they cover every bit of it, and we cover every bit of it with them. So depending upon whether it's multifamily or hospitality, hospitality is going to have some things in it like food and beverage permits and licenses, right? Hospitality. They're going to have franchise agreements. Multifamily doesn't have any of that, right? So there are going to be some things that are different in every deal you do. Just think different. There's different processes that are involved. Make sure you see widely enough, right? Get back away from that crazy thing and see widely enough to see the different processes and sub-processes that are involved. So, and our, back to RREAF, our deals vary. We do single asset deals where we'll acquire a single asset. We do multiple asset deals like TC21 or Southeast 3. That was 10 assets at a time. We do some hotel deals where we acquire 2 hotels at the same time. Because of this wide-ranging deal variation we're talking about, it demands, I use the word demands, it demands mastery of the acquisition process and problem solving at every level, So we're constantly reaching into the bag of experience and the experience of others, outside advisors and the like, to help make sure that we don't, at the battlefront again, hear the click. We don't ever want to hear the click. How do we do that? We make sure that we've done all the research and all the diligence and all the discussions and driven down into the detail as far as we can and gotten as far away from it as we can so we can see the whole battlefront to know how to walk through that thing and not step on one of those crazy things, right? That's the objective. In every acquisition, that's the objective. So that deal variation demands mastery. It demands mastery. So get good advisors, get good at this process and thinking through these processes. Be voracious when it comes to reading about these kinds of things, even reading through checklists, which seems like it's dry and stupid. But the more you fill your head up with these kinds of lists of things where you go, oh, wow, that issue is actually involved in this kind of thing, the more your brain will start to just sort of function naturally to start asking these kinds of questions as you develop in your expertise. It is a pleasure to have you here. Thank you for joining RREAF. You are some of our greatest resource. We genuinely believe that. We make every effort to truly invest in who you are and what you do and what you learn here. Congratulations on your progress so far and on becoming a RREAF intern. We look forward to working with you. And again, good luck.